So for all the Nigerians running from a seemingly dangerous situation and going some other place, what they fail to realize is that embedded in their Nigerians, they're going. And what happens, especially in their own instances, Nigeria specifically, is that you take your space and you try to impose it on the place you are in. So essentially, what we're doing is that we're exporting Nigerianness, and as in the prior conversations, Nigeria soft power. So the question we should be asking ourselves, is it a net loss to Nigeria? No. It's just a time that people decide, okay, we've had enough of this, and we're moving on to some other place. But in going off to this place, we're taking spaces with us, right? So you've had 2 or 3 generations of Nigerians who have displaced their place and imposed their spaces in these foreign places.
Sorry, Mr. Lardner, it's fantastic. It's just, I think, a really lovely jumping in point for her. Yeah, so I don't know, how would you come into this now as someone who's basically, I don't want to sound a certain way, a product of Jakpa's past, yeah? And coming home now, home in quotes, because home really is where home is, wherever that is, which I hope you'd share with us. How does this all, make you feel?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I guess I can provide a personal sort of view on Jakpa, because my parents Jakpa'd in the 80s, and I grew up in America, in England, still with a connection to Nigeria, but I guess in the sense that Nigerian identity and our sense of Nigerian identity is fluid, my sense of home is also fluid. And I think that that's very much true for Nigerians who are leaving Nigeria, who are Jakpa'ing now. But I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind, or to have perspective, because Jakpa is at top of mind now, but it's really like a cyclical phenomenon. Whenever economic conditions in Nigeria become very tight, which is often, there's a tendency for Nigerians to seek better pastures abroad. In the 80s, I remember my parents said that there were like commercials about checking out. So now it's Jakpa. Apparently in the 80s it was checking out. And I think that all of this, in a sense, contributes to how even Nigerians in Nigeria perceive themselves, because the inner identity is also kind of shaped by the identities of Nigerians abroad. And I think that it also kind of shapes our sense of home. Even as Nigerians, I think that our loyalty to the concept of Nigeria is maybe fluid. And maybe there's slightly more of a loyalty to tribe or ethnicity than to country. And even though it's quite a difficult decision for many people to leave Nigeria, I don't know that we're necessarily abandoning a sense of home, but I think we're kind of expanding our sense of home, expanding our definition of Nigerianness.
Thanks, Sabaki. Yeah. So, Ms. Nando, as a government type, in inverted commas, what would you have to add to this, especially regarding how people see, the current economic situation in the country? Many people feel that's a springboard for most, cases, let me call them that, of Jakpa, which, by the way, it's a massive phenomenon right now. If anyone is still not sure what it means, it's massive exodus of Nigerians, to a whole bunch of countries, mainly US, UK, Canada, those are the main ones. Even Australia, I think, is a trend now. And it's generally believed to be driven by economic issues. Everyone wants a better life. Now, just quickly before let me just share a little anecdote. I know a couple with 3 kids who were, they're kind of just an okay couple in Nigeria. And funny enough, they were having a few, economic issues as well, like the country. And they're always at each other's throats, It was a turbulent marriage, let me put it that way. Now, they jackpot like a month ago, hit the ground running because the husband works in fintech, and he got a nice a job somewhere, and she just went straight back to school, and suddenly they're quite active on social media, and if their social media is anything to go by, they're happy, they're thriving. I kid you not, they're just doing so wonderful. It's like they're a different, set of people. Yeah, so, I mean, there are a few horror stories, but there are also some good stories. So I don't know, what do you think? Are we losing some of our best? Because the husband and the wife, they're two kick-ass minds, brilliant minds. So, well, there's another angle to it, which I might, point out later. What do you think the government should do? We need to retain our talent. I don't know if everyone else shares this with me. It's not all about going to look for greener pastures.
So I think I really like what Abake said about it being cyclical, because I remember we also have come out from a phase of Africa Rising where everybody came back home. I think there was a time when I was away to school in Canada where if I decided to visit London, there was almost nobody to like hang with because everyone had come back home. And then a lot of those people have gone back out now. So I really like that. I always want people to, realize that it's cyclical. But from a government point of view, from an economic point of view, I think that people should definitely go where, they have the most opportunity. And for me personally, I have no plans to Japa. I have no intention to Japa. I can't really, be away from home. But I also think it's also a function of my own personal privilege. And that privilege is not really my background or, it's about the opportunity I have now to contribute to government because I work in government, and I can't kind of have the opportunity, run away and complain about it. It's better to, be here and try to improve on the situation. But from an economic point of view, I don't necessarily like to think of JAPA as us losing our brightest minds. Like she said, it's also about expanding our access to opportunity. It's also about exporting our culture, exporting our identity. So whilst people want to look at JAPA as a brain drain, I think of it as brain export. And like we were saying in our earlier conversation, it blows my mind that medical doctors are JAPAing from Nigeria to go and study medicine. It's very different from what you had maybe in the previous JAPA cycles where a doctor is migrating to Canada to go and be a taxi driver. A doctor is migrating to go and sweep the roads of London or to be, or to work at McDonald's. They're leaving, in fact, they are being recruited from here to go and study medicine. And for me, that says something about our medical institutions and our educational institutions, which we here always complain about, right? And what is it that, so clearly there's that useful background. The background that they have here is quite useful and not something that is not valued elsewhere. But I think that for government, the role that government has to play is to make sure it facilitates in a way that is productive the way in which we export brain power. So for instance, I know in places like Kenya, I think they've been in the news complaining about, I think they export a lot of domestic help and the government is involved. And there are issues with that, quite all right, because that's why it's in the news and we've been hearing about it. But I think that there's room for government to facilitate that, to actively produce medical, practitioners for export. The problem we have is that, the ratio as far as medical doctors to the general population is quite low. But there's no reason, since we know that the education that we're able to give to people who want to be doctors is useful, right? There's no reason for us why we cannot kind of facilitate that and make it something that we actively export. You have a bilateral agreement with people. You say, okay, you're going away for 3 years, you're going to come back, and things like that. So they're able to take what knowledge they have, get that exposure, and bring it back home. For government, another role I think government needs to play is to facilitate a sense of home and to make sure that we don't start to develop a destructive diaspora, right? When you hear about conflicts in Sri Lanka, like the Tamil Tigers and things like that, a lot of the funding for the Tamil Tigers comes from, the diaspora population. Here at home, there's talk that a lot of the activities of, IPOB and things and Boko Haram are funded from outside the country. So what you want to do is make sure that, for instance, it's as basic as improving the quality of consular services. Right, when my passport expires, what's the process of getting my passport when I'm in Ottawa? And making sure, for instance, that you're able to maintain that link that allows people still be there, but still consider Nigeria as home. There's also a role to play as far as finance. For all of the brains that we export, our remittances are low. Right? When you look at Philippines and how they're able to export service workers in the hospitality industry, Philippines relies a lot on those remittances. So why are we exporting so much? So that calls into question if it's actually a brain drain. Because if it's a brain drain, we expect to see the remittances back home. So if we're not seeing those remittances back home, maybe the JACPA data is like inflated. But there's also room, I think, to play to make sure that we're getting those remittances. When you have those bilateral agreements, you know that, okay, this doctor is going to be for 3 years. You expect that somehow they're going to come back home. They're going to send money home. And then, from the finance point of view, when someone sends me dollars, how do I get my dollars? Do I get the dollars at what rate? Do I get the naira? There are all those larger conversations that, the CBN and what's happening today as far as the exchange rate. But I think that there's definitely a huge role for government to play in that whole JACPA conversation.
Thanks, Thomas. Mr. Lardner, I'm interested in hearing what you think about, everything you've said so far, but from the point of view of the psychology of it, the mindset that leads to it. You mentioned something earlier that triggered this question. Yeah,
thanks. The mindset is just basically the etymology of the word JACPA, running away from a dangerous situation, and the assumption is you're fleeing into safety in a way. But that's not always the case. The story of the couple is exceptional. Most people start at the bottom of the societal ladder, and yes, given the fact that doctors are now being recruited, it says a lot about the quality of that dangerous situation that we're all running away from. Right? We all here, more or less, invariably are products of the Nigerian educational system. I definitely am. And so there's something there that has to be unpacked. But let me jump off to the point you were saying about dangerous diaspora and how do we change the dynamic. Many years ago, 30-something years ago, huge UN conference about reversing the brain drain. That was the argument then, brain drain, brain drain. It was as if collective consciousness was just leaching out of our bodies into some other place. But the argument then, and my own position then, was not so much as the brain drain, reversing the brain drain. You can't reverse the brain drain. If people choose to physically relocate into a place where they feel safe and all that, there's no point trying to bring them back here, because why would they want to come back here in the situation they're fleeing in the first place? I think the better alternative, which was mooted 30 years ago, was how do we harness our intellectual capital abroad? Because what we want is not the person, is not the corpus of the person, is the ideas. And that is where the idea of civic engagement comes in. We have a diaspora that is not woke, in the sense in which they have a commitment to repairing, restoring, and rejuvenating Nigeria. And that is where the psychological component is. How do you have an enlightened diaspora, right, whose intellectual capital can be harnessed for developing Nigeria here? Definitely the tools are available. You're a technologist, right? So it's really reframing the argument. I don't think it's a net loss to Nigeria, but we don't know how to capitalize on it yet. Somehow we're still stuck in the analog definition of jackpine. I'm physically removing myself from this dangerous situation and I'm moving to some other place. No, you're physically removing yourself from this dangerous situation because psychologically and mentally your mindset is one of defeatism. You don't want to stay here and do the work that is necessary to improve your situation. So you run, and it's a generational thing. And I'm just going to round up with two quotes that I think captures my own generational take on these younger people who are insistent on running away from themselves. Because you're Nigerian, you're Nigerian, you're Nigerian. One, I'm paraphrasing Franz Fanon. He said, every generation shall rise out of relative obscurity to find its mission, to fulfill it, or to betray it. So there is really almost an ethical responsibility for the jackpine generation to understand that they have to rise out of the relative obscurity of Nigeria to find their mission, to fulfill it, and betray it. In my own thinking, they're betraying it because they're escaping from the problems. But you know, when you're a jackpot and you jackpot by yourself, you have a whole village full of people that you're responsible for and to. The second quote is by, Frederick Douglass. And I paraphrase again. Power sees nothing without a demand, never has, never will. So this sense of entitlement, sitting down and saying, oh, they have to come and fix this problem, we didn't cause the problem, it's counterintuitive to me, right? Because what has happened is that you're dealing with the compounded problems of the past. And this is where another theory, I'm just going to just stop there, that has to do with this time-space thing I was talking about earlier on. I have this idea of how we as Africans experience space-time, right? For us as Africans, right, we don't talk about time dilation, we talk about time conflation, that as an African, you're simultaneously living your life in the past, the compounded present, and the potential future. The past, the compounded present, and the potential future. So the future is always a tabula rasa, is yet to be written. And the problem with the jackpot generation is that they don't want to write that future. They want to run into a place where the entire epistemology has been written, the systems work, lights go on, and they forget that they have to come back home because you're living in conflicted times. Your Nigerian past, your African past is going to haunt you everywhere you go. You show up with a green passport and you're Nigerian, they look at you funny. So it's a different mindset shift that is required generationally. You can jackpot all you want, but let's harness your intellectual capital to develop your country.
Thank you, Mr. Lardner. Now, someone I spoke to about this whole thing said something about, it all being about the economy, stupid, as they say. Now, I'm inclined to agree a bit, because let's look at it. It's the money. They're following the money, basically. How much is a dollar right now? Maybe. Can someone help me? How much? A black market, let's go with that. $7.60 to $8. $7.75. Did someone say EFCC is in the house? So just look at that, yeah? Now, if you're a Nigerian and let's say you're one of the very small group of people who earn about $1 million a month, and that's, let's say, 2 months, just 2 months ago, how much would that be in dollars? You could say, okay, X, maybe $2,000 a month, yeah? And then suddenly, you're earning, I don't know, maybe less than half of, almost, less than half of that a month in 2 months. So I think for me, the situation is that the graphs are just so dramatic. And people suffer from the drama, and then the PTSD pushes them to jackpot. So, yeah, what would you say, how do you think people should respond to economics?
So actually, I think that maybe if we take a little bit of a historical perspective, migration has always shaped African communities from a social and economic perspective. Just speaking personally, I know my great-grandmother migrated from Benin, this is more local, but she migrated from Benin to Ondo in search of better economic opportunities. And on my father's side, our grandmother migrated to the north and she ended up becoming a very successful trader. And so I think migration in search of economic opportunities to move in search of that, maybe this is a slightly obtuse perspective, but I think that having something of a pressure on the system from people leaving Nigeria for greener pastures, it's a sort of instrument to test the government, to force the government to improve systems, create government to act. Here are being raised by Nigerians in Nigeria. So Nigerians who are in Nigeria, some have come back from abroad, but they're founding tech companies in Nigeria, and they're raising substantial amounts of VC capital. And I think that if we also take a historical look and look at like the Jakba era in the 80s, there was also, I don't think it's really a narrative that part of human society, but I think that there are few instruments to force the Nigerian government to respond to the needs of Nigerian people. And I think this Jakba, in a sense, could
like saving like millions of naira and have like tens of thousands of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars to procure a new passport and things like that. We're not talking about that, low-level migration where, people are going to Italy by boat and things like that. So there's that allows us to question whether Jakpa is actually an economic activity or whether it's actually what, Mr. Ladner was saying about refusing to be at home and write that history and instead going to kind of coast or have a parasitic or, have a parasitic relationship off of other people's hard work because they have done the work to get to where they are, right? But as far as government, what government can do, I think, honestly, there's just so much that government needs to do, that they should, maybe I should say we, so it doesn't seem like I'm taking myself out of the equation. But there's so much that we can do and that we need to improve on. So, for instance, it's just basic things like consular services for those people who have already successfully done that. Because sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you are even away and you want to come back home and you can't even get a passport. And we were at home accusing you of Japan and running away from home, right? There are things like that. But also across the board, we can't sit down here and have this conversation. Jakpa is a direct consequence of everything that we're experiencing every day, every second, right? Whether it is police brutality, whether it is, low wages, no utilities, because like she was saying, you're doing those of us who are also here are doing so much to make ourselves comfortable. But I think that government needs to have a better understanding of it. I think, like what I just said, government kind of has that point of view, like, oh no, you want to Jakpa, it's because you have money, that's why you want to Jakpa. But government needs to take a more nuanced and dynamic approach to this to understand. And like I said, if you're going to export medical, skills, you also need to actively do that, while also making sure that you have some left over for your own population. And then also, I think fintech is very important, is very useful for this case study as far as government's approach, to tech and whether it understands it, whether it is crypto, whether it is Twitter, whether it is, and then on the other side saying, okay, yes, you can go, but these are the terms under which you should go and this is what we expect of you. I just think that, the response to Jakpa by government is not really a targeted response to Jakpa, but just the active work of making every Nigerian feel like home is home, and home is where I'm welcome, and home is where I can thrive, and home is where I can contribute, and also not have a parasitic relationship. I give and I also get in return. I obviously can answer this question because it's a really loaded question. Yeah.
Loaded questions is what we do at Ake. So, Mr. Ladner, back to you. Still on government, because let's face it, it's a good deal of what causes that migration. Even Jakpa, let's face it, is a lack of some key things, needed for a life. It doesn't even have to be a comfortable life per se. So, in a way, most Nigerians that are sort of like perceived to be high-income earners, let's face it, even they are living in a bubble. There's no light, you have to get an inverter or solar power, and then, everything, and then there's not enough security to travel just from one city to another. You can't even go to some markets, depending on what time of the year it is, whether there's a security report. It's all kinds of things, We don't even have enough time for me to list them. What do you think can be done by Nigerians? Let's leave the government out because, for the sake of this discussion, because obviously they're totally useless, yeah? What do you think citizens can do beyond Jakpa or apart from Jakpa I don't know, have a better sense of home to stay. I'm not against Jakpa, let me clarify, but just it feels like we're losing a lot. I mean, if it was the usual migration thing, you could say, yeah, there are good aspects to that. I mean, we have a lot of capital out there in the world, which I might even talk about a little later, but this, for the sake of this question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I disagree with the notion that government is absolutely useless. Government might be inefficient, as it were, but it's not exactly absolutely useless. And it's the point at which I deflect the focus from government to governance. The problem with Nigeria is not a government problem per se, it's a governance problem, specifically good governance. And that is where the intersection of citizen engagement, civic engagement, right? The challenge is that it's easy for us to deflect and say government. And government is respective, whoever comes in, it doesn't really matter, right? But the constant is governance. What is the quality of good governance? Why aren't we pushing for certain standards, right? Okay, but it's easier for us because we've been conditioned to just, at two levels. Either we outsource the problem to government, or for most Nigerians of the religious bent, we outsource the problem to God. It's always somebody else, some divinity, Deo ex machina will come and solve your problems. The problem is governance and civic engagement. And that's where this generation is failing itself. Somehow, they've been conditioned to believe that the solution to their problems lies with somebody else. They've denied themselves the agency to actually deal with the problems and say, okay, this is what we want. Okay, if this system doesn't work for you, why don't you design an alternative system? The problem is that in the public intellectual space, there are no alternatives. We've, bought into this narrative of bad government, bad this, bad. It's the same bad Nigeria that is exporting doctors. It's the same bad Nigeria as a product of all the things we're doing here. And the bench is deep. All you have to do is scratch the surface. I'm sure you can almost testify to that, at the amazing pool of talents indigenous. So even if people Jakpa, there is a fertile trough from which the system will feed off. The question is that how do we erect a governance structure? And how do we get young people? And again, in all this conversation, the demographics of Nigeria doesn't actually feature in it, right? I belong to the 7th percentile of Nigerians, right? If you consider the fact that the average age, the median age, I think 18, it's going to be a very young continent. And they have a long, space-time to fix this problem in future. I want to harken back to what Howard said yesterday about this burgeoning Africa mega experience that is coming. He specifically mentioned that the demographic population pressures will push all of these colonial boundaries aside, and in his own scenario, you'd have a long strip from Cote d'Ivoire to Benin to Nigeria, 600 miles of coastal line with 700 million people. Are we thinking about those things? Are young people who are going to live through these experiences thinking about that? No, I think not. They want to Jakpa. And Jakpa is not just the verb that takes you from one place to another place. Jakpa, in the instance of this generation, is the vacation of their own sense of identity. They want to run away from themselves. And it's like you're running away and your shadow is following you all over the place. And they don't understand that. Instead of saying, okay, not everybody can run out of Nigeria, they just released a report that I think 113 million Nigerians live in multidimensional poverty. That's huge. Huge. That's more than half of the population.
Sounds like a failure of government, or governance.
Of governance.
Whatever you want to
And so
choose.
by extension, because it's a failure of governance, not government in particular, we are all culpable in varying degrees. That is my own position, right? There's a certain degrees of complicity and in certain instances, compliance among the elite, all of us sitting down here.
Rural Nigeria wouldn't have any complicity, for instance, and they're hardest hit by security issues.
Yeah, but it's a failure of governance. The reason why rural Nigeria is because the leadership itself.
Governance, back to what I said.
Governance, not government. Us collectively have failed to hold. The difference in this guy's book, what's this guy's name? The guy who wrote Guns, Gems, and Steel, collapse. He says the singular most common feature of collapsed systems is that the systems that fail to hold their elites accountable for their misdeeds. So who holds the elite accountable? Who holds the elite?
Well, we saw what happened with NSARS.
That is the inflection point. So NSARS happened. Is it an event or is it a process? For young people, it's an event. Oh, we went this, that. You know, my own generation had their own version of NSARS.
There was a lot of spin going on there to make it look like an event.
We're living in virtual reality, my brother.
I'm saying, it was made to look like an event. To look like an event.
No,
it was actually...
But the thing about it, who are the owners of that movement? You cannot have somebody impose their own reality on your own perception of reality. If young people choose to make NSARS an event, it is on them. How do you make it a process? And that is where the hard graft is.
I totally disagree. I still feel that, you know, a lot of it, you know, it's been repositioned. Unfortunately, we're not having an NSARS panel. I would have loved to talk more about this. We should after the panel, you know, but I think a lot of it was spun around by government.
This is the same
Spin
argument
doctors went into overdrive.
Wait, listen to me. Listen, I'm not interested in what happened, who said what, where, why, and how. I'm talking about the fundamental loss of agency. That is my challenge. It's a loss of agency amongst a generation that started something. And oh, by the way, it's not entirely lost. The political landscape is changing because of NSARS. I'm working on police sector reforms, right? And the reason why we're talking about police sector reforms is because of NSARS. So there's a long tail that has happened, and it's not entirely lost. The question is, how do we get young people organized, energized, to the point where they say, you know what? Yeah, some of you guys might jack, but we're going to be working with you guys. You're providing financial capital and intellectual capital, but we're going to fix this problem. It's a generational problem. It has nothing to do with the past, to the extent to which that's it. We failed. We have failed. So what do you do now? Woe is me, I'm going to Jackpa. You can't do that.
In defense of Jackpa, and I'm just going to use this to round up from here, then the audience would ask questions to individual panelists, is that another side to this, not the Jackpa part, the part where Nigerians are out there, creating basically a Nigerian empire, music, movies, arts, science, come on, tech, everything really. So I think there's also a little bit of a positive aspect to see, in all this, but it still doesn't take away the heartbreak when, you see Nigerians just want to go somewhere else. I mean, come on, Nigeria is a fantastic place to live in, So I guess that's where the pain comes from, when you look at the government. And like in my own case, I said they're useless. I still believe they're useless. And it's governance. I agree with what you said, regarding that. So to just keep quiet right now and ask for questions, Zukiswa is quite compelling. So yes, please start. Very short questions, no two-pronged ones, please. Oh, okay, okay. After Zukiswa, I would like Professor Howard. Okay. No, Leia, you answer questions all the time.
Sorry, I wanted to, I think, Tunji, you just mentioned the generational problem, and I actually think NSARS was actually a process as opposed to an event, but I don't think it's a generational, it is a general. Then the question, both of you said, Ms. Nandul, you said something about remittances and how like people in Philippines send a whole lot of remittances, and this is not happening with Nigeria. And then Tunji, you mentioned the idea of even intellectual contribution. But if a Nigerian in London, if a Nigerian in South Africa cannot vote for politics in Nigeria, then why do they need to be invested in Nigeria? What is Nigeria giving back to them?
Thank you, Zukiswa. Now, before he answers, I just want to make something very clear. I think Mr. Lardner is among the best we have. I have tremendous respect for him. I love the work he does. I've been a huge fan. All the various sectors, the sandboxes he's played them, to his best, which is quite good. So, please. Oh, you want them all the questions?
Let me ask
quickly.
Okay, no, it's true about it. Thanks for saving my hide here on this place. I was sweating there. But the truth about it is, yes, I think I did issue a minor mea culpa. I said it categorically that we have failed. We have to understand that, okay? But the question is that why are you following the trail of our failures? Why are you accusing us of having failed? Okay, so we failed. Fuck it. The question is, what are you going to do to redeem yourself? Remember, I talked about my notion of Africa's experience, time conflation, right? I've written about it, Africa's time conflation challenge. That whereas Africans simultaneously living our lives in the past, right? Terrible past, me, responsible for it. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Your compounded problems, which is here and now, I'm going to japa. But the beautiful thing is about the future is yet to be written. It's a tabula rasa. Nobody says it's going to happen the way we have compounded the problems. So I take that thing, turn it around, and I throw it back at you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lardner.
So I want to contribute to this conversation and say that I feel seen by Mr. Lardner. It's really lonely being a young person in government. And I always say, they don't rate me, I don't rate them. Because a lot of times, like when you're in public sector and you're having to deal with the private sector and you're trying to deal with government, by the grace of God, we have a democracy now. We have elections every 4 years. Government are people, right? Whether elections are rigged or not is a totally different conversation, but the fact is that people now have more opportunities to get into government. And when he says loss of agency, yes, loss of agency I think is not even perfect because it makes it seem like something that's been taken away from you. And to an extent, it's been taken away from us, but there's also a hesitation to also take it, right? NSAS, good governance is a movement like any other thing, whether it is slavery or feminism, it's sustained effort. It's not, they said they were going to give us a panel and they said they were going to disband, so now I don't want, I'm going to leave. I think young people need to be more active in government, whether it is joining a political party. So for me, I think joining a political party is very important, right? Every time people complain, we have, you don't like any of the candidates, so you're not going to vote. So how about you get in and make sure you have at least one good egg on the ballot in the first place, not allow people who are in the parties to make their choice and then you come and complain and things like that. And then for the issue about diaspora voting, it's not a Nigerian problem. Very few countries have diaspora voting. But that does not change the fact that, like I was saying earlier, for me, Japa is an emotional thing. There's no version of events where I Japa, because like Japa is usually a nuclear endeavor, right? You move with your wife, your kids, and then that's it. Maybe you try to file for Mama 4 years later when you have citizenship. But I live in Kaduna. There's no version of events where I would like Japa from Nigeria and then be in like Australia, and then something goes down, and then I'm like, like my grandma is dead, and my classmates and everybody I know are gone, but like I made it, like I'm here. Like, no, right? So that speaks to the important work of staying back and doing the work. Nobody is really taking your agency from you as much as you have not tried to participate. I think. So thank you. I feel seen.
Then before then, just so it's not one-sided, Tamar is also among our best. She's doing a lot of incredible work in the Kaduna State government. Yeah, we're proud of her. And so now I'm going to call on Dr. Howard Nabila Usman to ask questions.
Thank you and good morning. Excellent panel. This strikes me as a very Nigerian discussion, right? And I have to respectfully say that, as you can see, and as you all know, I'm not Nigerian. So I submit my thoughts to you with humility and beg your forbearance. A few years ago, when I wrote a previous book, I had a very interesting discussion with some Ghanaian intellectuals on similar problems. And one of them said something to me which I wrote and which has stuck with me, which is that the brain drain, quote unquote, the African brain drain is woefully misunderstood. That if Canadians or Americans or British or French or whoever want to take our doctors, that's good for Ghana because it forces us to train more doctors. And to the extent that we train more doctors, we're also training many other people who set out to be doctors or who are stimulated by the thought of professional careers and choose other things eventually other than medicine, et cetera, et cetera. It forces us to raise our game. And in the meantime, maybe not everyone, maybe not in the form of direct remittances, but a great number of those people who go on to become professionals in Canada or France or Britain or India or where have you, return to Ghana or sponsor other people from the next generation or contribute to ideas in the country and the conversation around the situation of the country. And so this person was suggesting to me in a way that I found compelling that this problem needs to be seen in a more holistic way. Now, the Nigerian piece of this problematic I want to suggest to you is that as Tamar Nandu said, you know, it's certainly true that I'm not Nigerian, but I've been in Nigerian consular offices, okay? And there are problems, okay? I can only imagine what it's like to go as a Nigerian. It has not been pleasant as an American, right? Okay. But that's just the tip of your fingernail in terms of what the Nigerian government needs to do. Many of the problems, as I see them, as an outsider who has been coming to Nigeria since 1977, appeared to me to be very simple problems. Persistent but simple. Why are there long gasoline lines in Nigeria? Why is there no electricity in Nigeria? These are not, to use the cliche, rocket science or nuclear physics, okay? Why is there not universal education in Nigeria? These are problems that other societies have figured out, other poorer societies than Nigeria have figured out long ago, okay? And so the question I have for the panel is, if the Nigerian system of governance over a series of governments have not solved these basic problems. The JAPA is not just about the economy stupid, like there's better job overseas. It's about you don't feel safe, you can't move around your city because the transit times are so terrible, you can't find gasoline. You know, as Fela said, they've turned electric to candle, et cetera, et cetera. These are grave things that are not mysterious, okay? So the question I have, might it not be the case that the people who have occupied the series of Nigerian governments actually don't want to solve those problems? They don't want to solve these problems, perhaps because they don't want the burden of citizens who have a better access to the rights and privileges that most people in most countries take as normal features of citizenship, because that's competition for them, right? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. Now, before we pick the lucky person to answer that, how much time do we have left? The timer stopped. Oh, no time? So whoever is going to speak will 3 minutes, 3 seconds, what? Oh, okay. 10, love you. So, eeny, meeny, miny, Doctor, Mr. Ladner.
Thanks, yes. Maybe they don't want to fix the problem. I mean, it's part of that. I mean, I've known Howard now from the 80s. We were both journalists then. He was writing for, I think, Reuters, or something like that. Sorry? Washington Post, yes. And I remember going to his apartment in swanky Ikoyi and drinking nice wine and talking. Ipso